Hi there, I'm Sam, a Cambridge economics student and someone who managed to achieve full marks in the majority of their A-level economics essays. And this video is going to be all about evaluation, what it is, why it matters, and most importantly, how to do it. And throughout this video, I'm going to show examples of okay, good, and great evaluation. I guess a good place to start is answering the question, what even is evaluation? Well, Learn Economics says, to evaluate in economics means to consider the value of something, an explanation, theory, or policy, in terms of whether it achieves an objective or provides an effective explanation. Now, I think this does a pretty good job of defining what evaluation truly is. If you want to think about it a little bit simpler, evaluation is basically just answering the question, what does this depend on, or why may this be limited? So in practice, when you're actually doing your A-level economics essays, what does this evaluation really look like? Well, the A-level economics essays will ask you to discuss, assess, or evaluate how event or policy A could impact, affect, or cause outcome or event B. And our responses to these essay questions will dive into the economic theory we have learned throughout the A-level economic course. And this theory we're talking about in our essays accounts for the knowledge, application, and analysis. And then our responses will talk about why the theory we outlined earlier may not be as effective as it first seemed. And all of this is the evaluation. So now you know what evaluation is, but we still have the question, why does it matter? Well, for pretty much every exam board, good evaluation is the key to unlocking the higher marks in your essays. For example, for AQA, to jump above the 20-mark threshold, you have to go from some supported evaluation to well-supported evaluation. That is the key difference between a level 4 response and a level 5 response. For Pearson and Edexcel, it's even more extreme. 9 marks are available for evaluation, which means if you don't do any evaluation, you're capped at 16 out of 25. Again, for OCR, to get above 20, you have to have strong evaluation compared to only good evaluation. And I could keep going through examples from different exam boards showing that evaluation really is the key for your essays. So now we figured out what evaluation is and why it's so important, let's go on to figure out how to actually evaluate. What I'm going to talk about here are different types of evaluation, i.e. different things you can consider, and I'll provide some examples when you're evaluating different points in your essays. So the first thing you can consider when evaluating is short run versus long run. Quite simply, what are the short run versus long run implications from a particular policy or event? To illustrate this point, let's look at an example. Consider some sort of policy which forces monopolies to either set a lower price or operate closer to the point of allocative efficiency. To evaluate this policy using the short run versus long run framework, you could write something like this. In the short run, this policy is effective as it reduces the price of the good for consumers today. However, when considering longer time horizons, the effectiveness of this policy may be limited. This is because the reduction in supernormal profit could reduce the level of dynamic efficiency for the monopoly. This is because they have less funds available for internal investment and R&D, so it may be less likely to discover a cost-saving technology or practice that could reduce prices in the future. So there's an example about when you can talk about short-run benefits versus long-run costs, but it could also be the other way around. Maybe there's some short-run costs, but you reap long-run benefits. For example, think about a policy where the government spends a lot of money on training and education schemes. Obviously, there's a short-run cost, i.e. the government has an opportunity cost of those foregone funds which are used for the schemes, but in the long run, we may reap the benefits, i.e. an increase in long-run aggregate supply as a result of a more productive workforce. Other than these short-run versus long-run implications, something else to really consider in your evaluation are potential negative consequences. So a lot of the time when we're talking about a policy, this can achieve the desired aim, but it comes at the cost of some negative consequences to someone else. Another easy example of these negative consequences could be thought about when considering a negative externality in consumption. If we're thinking about policies to correct this negative externality, one example may be an indirect tax. Assuming the correctly sized tax is applied, this can bring us back to our socially optimal level of consumption, and therefore it could be seen that the policy has the desired effect. However, there's a negative consequence associated with this, i.e. higher prices for the consumer. If you can really take some time to think about a policy and all the different negative consequences that could arise as a result, it really helps give detailed and deep evaluation. Another really easy thing to consider is just questioning the underlying assumptions that an argument has. So a lot of the arguments and theory you are taught in the A-level course is conditional on a set of underlying assumptions. Challenging how realistic these assumptions are in reality, and hence challenging the argument as a whole, is a really good way to evaluate. And of course, there are also other basic things to consider. For example, elasticities of supply and demand. This applies to all essays which have anything to do with the goods market and also anything to do with the labour market. Another really basic thing to consider are timeframes, i.e. how long will it take for a particular policy to reap the rewards you spoke about in your analysis. For example, consider an essay which is talking about how to reduce unemployment in the UK. A particular infrastructure project, e.g. HS2, takes a pretty long time to implement and actually see the rewards. So these are all things you can consider when doing your evaluation. But what's really important is going really deep and expanding on each individual point rather than just listing an array of individual points. I like to call this breaking the surface level of evaluation. To see what I mean by this, let's look at the example I discussed earlier, i.e. an indirect tax correcting a negative externality in consumption. And for this case, let's say the specific negative externality is related to cigarette smoking. Now, very basic, i.e. surface level evaluation would look something like this. Although an indirect tax may be effective at reducing the quantity consumed to the socially optimal level, this comes with the consequence of higher prices for the consumer. So this may make the policy less effective. As you can see, all it is a really basic 1 or 2 lines of evaluation, which doesn't really go that deep into anything at all. Evaluation which goes a little bit deeper would look something like this. Although an indirect tax may be effective at reducing the quantity consumed to the socially optimal level, this comes with the consequence of higher prices for the consumer. It is important to note that cigarettes are highly addictive, which means we are likely to see a relatively inelastic demand curve. As a result, the price increase we witness will be large compared to a reduction in quantity consumed. Thus, the majority of the tax burden will be borne on the consumer. Obviously, I would show this alongside a diagram with this inelastic demand curve, but as you can see, this is essentially the same point, but all I've done is gone deeper into the evaluation. I said this price increase is going to be really bad because of the inelastic demand curve, which leads to a big increase in price for only a relatively small reduction in quantity. But we can still improve it. In my eyes, evaluation I'd want to be looking for in my exam would go something like this. Although an indirect tax may be effective at reducing the quantity consumed to the socially optimal level, this comes with the consequence of higher prices for the consumer. It is important to note that cigarettes are highly addictive, which means we are likely to see a relatively inelastic demand curve. As a result, the price increase we witness will be large compared to the reduction in quantity consumed. Thus, the majority of the tax burden is borne on the consumer. This large increase in price, coupled with the fact that smoking rates are higher among low socioeconomic groups, means it could be argued that this policy is regressive. As households from low socioeconomic groups may be spending a larger proportion of their incomes on cigarettes, in response to this policy, this may reduce their spending on other things, such as merit goods, exacerbating the underconsumption witnessed in these markets, potentially leading to further market failure. Additionally, we may see an increase in low-income households not being able to afford their basic needs, and consequently see an increase in UK poverty rates. Due to the recessive nature of the tax and the possibility of it creating further market failure and increased poverty levels, it may not be as effective a policy as first seemed. As you can see, all 3 of these paragraphs of evaluation are essentially the same point, which is that the tax can lead to higher prices, and that may be bad. But they vary significantly in regard to the level of detail and depth. Where possible, try and make your evaluation as detailed and deep as possible. So now you know that not all evaluation is created equally, i.e. the more depth and detailed you can make your evaluation, the better. And this is something a lot of students struggle to do. Something else a lot of students struggle to do is evaluate their evaluation. The best way for me to explain what evaluating your evaluation means is via an example. Consider the evaluative point I made before about why indirect taxes may not be that effective. What I would make sure to do after doing that is to evaluate that evaluation and hopefully come to some sort of judgment, which would look something like this. However, the government will receive some amount of tax revenue as a result of this policy. The amount they receive will also be relatively large due to the inelastic demand curve. Hence, they could use this collected tax revenue in order to counteract the potential negative consequences discussed above. For example, by subsidising merit goods to ensure they are not underconsumed. Ultimately, the probability of these negative consequences being realised is dependent on how the government chooses to allocate the tax revenue it receives. And all this does is add another layer of evaluation and show the examiner I can actually reach a judgment. So using this example, my evaluation would ultimately look like this. I'd firstly evaluate the original point, talk about why it may be limited, and some negative consequences that could arise as a result of the policy. And secondly, I would explain why these negative or unintended consequences could be counteracted, and ultimately what it depends on. In this case, how the government chooses to spend that tax revenue it collects. So to bring it all together and provide a detailed overview of this video, it goes something like this. Evaluation is essentially asking the question, why may this be limited? It's so important as it allows you and enables you to access the higher marks in your A-level economics essays. You can evaluate by considering short run versus long run, unintended consequences, theory versus reality, etc. To really improve your evaluation, you want to break past the surface level and provide a good level of detail and depth. And finally, you want to ensure you're evaluating your evaluation and actually reaching some sort of judgment. If you can do all of that, it puts you in the best position possible going into your A-level exams. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. And if you want to actually see those essays where I got full marks in my actual exams, click on this video over here. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.